you're well. Welcome to this video on fairies and Djinn. And I want to look at their similarities in their origin myths and their supposed behaviours. But I want to also look at, say, the societal purpose of using fairies and djinns as metaphors. So to start with, I'm just going to go to two books as reference material for this. One is Ancient Legends of Ireland by Lady Wilde, and the other book is British Fairies by John Kruse. So to start with, there's a chapter called the She race. So the term she is S-I-D-H-E, but it's pronounced she, which is a Gaelic word for fairy. So this quick passage I'm going to read, I'm going to then kind of dissect the themes in it to explain the kind of broad function of what the fairy race represents in Irish culture, and then kind of show that there are Djinn equivalents in Islamic culture. The She dwell in Shifra, a fairy palace of gold and crystal, in the heart of the hill, and they have been given youth, beauty, joy, and the power over music. Yet they are often sad, for they remember when they were once angels in heaven, and how, cast down to earth, and even though they have powers all over the mysteries of nature, yet they must die without the hope of regaining heaven, while mortals are certain of immortality. Therefore this one sorrow darkens their life, a mournful envy of humanity, because while man is created immortal, the beautiful fairy race is doomed to annihilation. So that's the first point. We'll come back to that in a second. One day a great fairy chief asked Columkill, who was an Irish saint, if there was any hope left to the She that they would one day regain heaven and be restored to their ancient place amongst the angels. But the saint answered the hope there was none. Their doom was fixed, and at judgment day they would all pass through death into annihilation, for that had been decreed by the justice of God. On hearing this, the fairy chief fell into profound melancholy, and he and all his court sailed away from Ireland and went back to their native country of Armenia. There's a weird reference in just stopping reading now. There's a weird references in this book to the fairies coming from the east, and I'll pick that up in another bit later. But also the Irish people coming from the east. Now, whether there's any truth in that at all is up for debate. So they returned to their native country of Armenia, there to await the coming of the terrible judgment day, where is fated to bring the fairy race to certain death on earth without any hope of regaining heaven. The west of Ireland is particularly sacred to the ancient superstitions of the She race. There is a poetry in the scenery that touches the heart of the people. They love the beautiful glens, the mountains rising like towers from the sea, and the islands sanctified by the memory of a saint, and the green hills where Finvara holds court. So Finvara is the king of the fairies in Irish myth. Every lake and mountain has its legend of a spirit land, some holy traditions of a saint, or some historic memory of a national hero who flourished in the old days when Ireland had native chiefs and native swords to guard her. And amongst the Western Irish, especially the old superstitions of their forefathers are reverenced. With a solemn faith and a fervour that is almost a religion, Finvara the king is still believed to rule over the fairies of the West, and Una is the fairy queen. Her golden hair sweeps to the ground, and she is robed in silver gossamer, all glittering as if with diamonds. But they are dewdrops that sparkle all over it. The queen is more beautiful than any woman of the earth, yet Finvara loves the mortal woman best, and wiles them down to his fairy palace with the subtle charm of the fairy music, for no one who has heard it can resist its power, and they are fated to belong to the fairies ever after. Their friends mourn them as dead, with much lamentation, but in reality they are leading a joyous life down in the heart of the hill in the fairy palace, with silver columns and crystal walls. Yet sometimes they are not drawn down to the earth, but remain as usual in daily life, though the fairy spell is still on them, and young men who have heard the fairy harp become possessed by the spirit of the music which haunts them to their death. Okay, so in that passage, there's an awful lot going on, and I want to kind of go through it. So the first thing you have is that fairies live in the She Kingdom. So it's a liminal land that is aligned next to ours, that's accessed through the barrows under the hill, like they mentioned. So it's somewhere similar, but not quite. The Djinn is very much the same. They are living in old ruins, same as the fairies live in fairy forts, which are like megalithic forts or old rats, that kind of thing. Now, the second element here is the Angelic Link. So we have the story of them being cast down. They're cast down angels, and I'll go through another passage on that. But that's exactly like the myth around Iblis, where on the creation of man, the angels are commanded by God to bow down to his new creation. Iblis, who is, while is part of the angelic host, seems to not actually be an angel, but to be a Djinn of particular repute and intellect, that he has been elevated to live amongst the angels. But having free will, he refuses to bow down to the human being, seeing himself as innately superior. He is made of sounding clay, i.e. the human is made of sounding clay, and the Djinn is made of fire, and sees itself as superior and refuses to bow down. This results in the casting down of Iblis, or in Christian mythology, Lucifer, or the Shaitan figure. This results in the casting down of Iblis with a host of angels who rebelled against God. So the fairies are seen as being directly these angels who have been cast down by God. They're seen specifically those who lost in that battle. The Djinn are not. The Djinn are a separate race, but there is a link in the narrative. The same trigger caused the Djinn to turn against God and become the enemy of humanity. And here you can see this passage talks about the envy that the fairies have of the humans, and this leads to a certain tension. So in this passage, the fairy king asks Columkill if they'll ever regain access to heaven, in which he's told they won't. And this is illustrating the subjugation of the fairies under the dominant Abrahamic religion. Again, a very common theme within Djinn lore. Djinn and fairies, while both have powers over nature, they still are subjugated under God's rule. And then that's local God's rule, whatever the local dominant religion is, be it Islam or Catholicism. We also have King Finvara. So there's the link there to kingship and queenship. And that's that clan structure. Same within the Djinn. Within Djinn tradition. The supernatural beauty. Same within the Djinn tradition. The seduction of human beings. So Finvara is prone, has a predilection for human girls, and has a reputation for seduction. This motif occurs all the time within fairy lore and within Djinn lore. All the time there is a moral danger of falling under the spell and being seduced by, and ultimately copulating with, a fairy or a Djinn, with some kind of disastrous result. In the production of a child, or one tends to come a cropper in some description. Or the individual in this case will be punished in some way for their transgression. Either they'll be lost to fairyland or to the Djinn, or they'll lose their status within the human world, deemed as mad. There'll be some punishment for this transgression. The seduction, or the submission to the seduction of the fairy or the Djinn, has a penalty, whereas somebody can disappear, be away with the fairies, as the expression is in Ireland. And finally, they talk about hearing fairy music and being able to understand fairy music or replicate fairy music, but at the same time never being able to get it to the level of perfection as the young men had heard it initially in this story. Drives them crazy. So that gives you an idea of the various motifs that are there, and kind of other ones that you can kind of unpack, is that there's just as many types and variants of fairy as there are of jinn. For all the marids and quarines and afrits, there are a whole plethora of different types of fairy with different types of special skills of powers to fear. There's just as many within fairy lore across Britain and Ireland, and the same indeed in the Scandinavian world. So one of the broader things that I wanted to kind of touch on as well is that there is the whole concept of a moral warning, that there's something there within a lot of fairy stories and jinn stories which it represents a warning. Now these warnings tend to be to children and women in particular, so it's not surprising that in kind of a patriarchal framework of Abrahamic religions that the lore that runs alongside of it, of these supernatural beings, tends to want to keep children and keep women under that kind of patriarchal control. So touching first on the motifs of children and how fairies and stories of fairies are used to serve as a supernatural warning to keep children keep children safe, essentially. So you have the kind of motifs of fairies living in particular bodies of water that are not safe. For example, ponds in Britain had a character called Jenny Greenteeth, who was a particularly unpleasant form of fairy that would lurk in the pond and then snatch children from the bank who had got too close. It's quite a simple motif. It's telling, it's a way of scaring kids from going near water which could endanger them. The same motif is used around kind of the idea of the bogeyman. Bogies were a particular type of fairies, and that motif has lasted well up into the modern age of a tool used to scare children away from places that could harm them. The exact same motifs exist within Islam, the Islamic world, and jinn. I remember reading about a specific jinn that was known to tempt children by the River Nile by having balls float on the water. And the child would go in to try and get the ball and be taken away. Similarly, where there's a moral question, particularly sexual morality, a jinn would present itself as a beautiful young woman in water, submerged to the waist, and seduce a young man to come in after her, only to drag him down to the bottom of the river and drown him. So that was that. I mean, that's a common motif. You see that again and again. But particularly around women, as I mentioned earlier, there's the moral enforcement. And again, this is a societal thing, but it's using the motif of fairies to drive a message home, where behaviour that's seen as promiscuous will be punished. And often in fairy lore, this was being punished by pinching black and blue the body of the offending young lady. So where do they come from? Again, these motifs, or what are they? The other element of this is the type of names used to refer to jinn and fairies, in that they're totally ambiguous. They don't really, people tend to not want to actually name them. So in Ireland, it's the other crowd, the little people, the blessed people, all that those kind of terminology were used. All across the British Isles, it's the same thing. The good people, good neighbours, honest folk, the fair family, which was a Welsh one, obviously not in Welsh language. The gentry, people of the peace, the seedy court, the blessed court, seedy witch, the Ní Cura, which is the honest folk in Scots Gaelic, the Cornish pobl van, which means little people. Another Welsh term is Bendith Waimamu, the mother's blessing. And then you have in the Arabic world terms like Mubarakin, the blessed ones. So it's very similar stuff. And again, it's just that there's just that reticence to use the actual name. Now, the other side of it is the idea that the fairies will not give their actual name. If they had their name revealed, that would give some kind of control to the human being they were engaged with. The story Rumpelstiltskin is an example of this. So what are these things? And by kind of looking at what they are and looking at the motifs, we can try to get a sense of where they come from and where there may be a lot of cultural ideas here at play. British Fairy Origins by Lewis Spence, was published in 1946, and he had a lifelong interest in the occult mythology. And he set out a number of sources which he felt jointly fed into the fairy belief that the fairies were elemental spirits. They are spirits of nature features. Spirits of the dead. Fairies are, in a sense, simply ghosts. They haunt burial sites. The deceased are often found amongst their number. I mean, that does occur again and again in fairy stories. They're ancestral spirits, more than just being the dead, the dead of a particular family, and are protective over their predecessors. You could relate that to kind of the Banshee. They're the Aboriginal races, so the Aboriginal inhabitants of Britain and Ireland, who were pushed to the margins by later land settlers. Former pagan gods, so diminished survivors of like the ancient Tuatha De Danann, or fallen angels, as we touched on earlier. There are also more recently, Catherine Briggs laid out a compelling theories of her book, Fairies and Traditions in Literature, and her list is very similar to Spence's, so that fairies derive from forgotten gods and nature spirits, the host of the dead, fallen devils, giants and monsters, and tutelary spirits, which comprise of ancestral spirits attached to a particular family, like the Banshee. There's also the similarity of in relation to children. So there's an awful lot of taboo around newborn children and fairies in the whole theory of changelings, which I've discussed in detail before, where babies are believed to have been stolen and in their place left a changeling, a kind of an ugly, wizened version of their child. How people would try and get their own babies back would be extraordinarily cruel methods of torturing the changeling, essentially. Now, while the idea of changelings did exist in the Arabic world, I don't know about the kind of methods of dealing with it. But I do know that a lot of kind of talismanic, there were a lot of talismans used to protect mothers and young mothers and their children from the attentions of the Djinn, particularly characters like Lilith. So Lilith was seen as the enemy of young mothers and children alike, and that came also from her jealousy of not being the mother of the human race. When Lilith and Adam didn't quite get it together, where she famously said, "I will not lie below," she lost her chance to be the mother of the human race. And as a result, she became this demonic figure who enacted a vengeance on the human race and was attributed with attempting to kill newborn children. So that figure was ultimately became a kind of a Djinn type figure, and was a source of terror for young mothers. So there was all that kind of taboo around the fairy and Djinn interest in newborns. Talismans against Djinn and against fairies were very similar, particularly iron and steel. So there is an aversion from fairies from any forged metal, but particular iron and steel. When I was in India researching Djinn, one of the sites I visited, they had an iron chain outside the door of a Sufi shrine to test to see if somebody had a Djinn possession or not. In that, if they had a Djinn possession, they could not hold the chain because of its iron. And similarly, in Celtic folklore, to protect your newborn from fairy abduction, you would open iron tongs over the crib. Now that had a secondary function of looking like a cross, but it was also specifically made of iron. So finally, I'm going to read a little passage from Lady Wilde's Ancient Legends of Ireland. And this passage is called Popular Notions Concerning the She-Race. From the earliest ages, the world has believed in the existence of a race midway between the angel and man, gifted with the power to exercise strange, mysterious influence over human destiny. Well, there you go. It's the third race, as outlined within Islamic lore: angels, man, and jinn. The Persians called this mystic race Fairies. The Egyptians and Greeks called them demons, not as evil, but as mysterious allies of man, invisible although ever present, capable of kind acts but implacable if offended. The Irish call them the She, or spirit race, or the Fairy, a modification of the word Peri. Their country is Tirnanog, the land of perpetual youth, and they live a life of joy, beauty, never knowing disease or death, which is not to come to them until Judgment Day, when they are fated to pass to annihilation, or perish utterly and be seen no more. They can assume any form and make horses out of bits of straw on which they ride over the country, and to Scotland and back. They have no religion, but a great dread of the scapular, Latin words of the Gospels written by a priest and hung around the neck. Their power is great over unbaptized children, and such generally grow up evil and have the evil eye and bring ill luck. Unless the name of God is instantly invoked, they will look at anyone fixedly and in silence. All over Ireland, the fairies have a reputation for being very beautiful, with long yellow hair sweeping to the ground and lithe, light forms. They love milk and honey, and sip the nectar from the cups of flowers, which is their fairy wine. Underneath the lakes and deep down in the heart of the hills, they have fairy palaces of pearl and gold where they live in splendour and luxury, with music and song and dancing and laughter. All the joyous thing as befits the gods of the earth. If our eyes were touched by a fairy salve, we would see them dancing on the hill in the moonlight. They are served on vessels of gold, and each fairy chief, to mark his rank, wears a circlet of gold around his head. The She race were once angels in heaven, but they were cast out for punishment of their pride. Some fell to earth, and others were cast into the sea, while many were seized by demons and carried down into hell, where hence they issued as evil spirits to tempt men to destruction under various guises, chiefly, however, as beautiful young maidens endowed with the power of song and gifted with the most enchanting wiles. Under the influence of these beautiful sirens, a man would commit any and every crime. Then, when his soul is utterly black, they carry him down to hell, where he remains himself, forever tortured by the demons to whom he sold himself. The fairies are very numerous, more numerous than the human race. In their palaces under the hills and under the lakes, and in the sea, they hide away much treasure. All of the treasure of the wrecked ships is theirs. All of the gold that men have hidden and buried in the earth when danger was on them, and then died and left no sign of the place to their descendants. All of the gold in the mine and the jewels in the rocks belong to them, and it is in Shifra, or fairy house. The walls are silver and the pavement is gold, and the banquet hall is lit by the glitter of diamonds that stud the rocks. If you walk 9 times round a fairy wraith at the full of the moon, you will find the entrance to Shifra. But if you enter, beware of eating the fairy food or drinking the fairy wine. The She will indeed wile and draw many a young man into a fairy dance, for the fairy women are beautiful, and so beautiful that a man's eyes grow dazed who look upon them, and their long hair floating like ripe golden corn, and their robes of silver gossamer. They have perfect forms, and their dancing is beyond all expression graceful. But if a man is tempted to kiss a Sheog, a young fairy spirit, in the dance, he is lost forever. The madness of love will fall him, and he will never again be able to return to the earth, or leave the enchanted fairy palace. He is dead to his kindred and race forevermore. On Fridays, the fairies have special powers over all things, and chiefly on that day they select and carry off the young mortal girls as brides for fairy chiefs. But after 7 years, when the girls grow old and ugly, they are sent back to their kindred, giving them, however, as compensation, a knowledge of herbs and philters, and secret spells by which they can kill or cure and have the power over men for both good and evil. It is in this way that wise women and fairy doctors have acquired their knowledge of the mysteries and magic of herbs. But fairies do not always keep the mortal women in 7 years' bondage. Sometimes they take away only young girls for a dance in the moonlight, and leave them back in their own home, lulled into a sweet sleep. But the vision of the night was so beautiful that the young girls longed to dream again and be happy with the soft enchantments of music and dance. Okay, we'll leave it there. Now, again, you can see the motifs. again and again. It's the theme of, it's a third race. There's the angelic transgression. There's the theme of being under the earth and preying on human beings for entertainment of some description. And there's always some kind of sexual congress or seduction. The moral element, the moral questions, the warning elements are definitely a human projection or a human device. But it's interesting that in that particular passage, Lady Wilde opens up and says belief in these beings comes from Persia. Again, is this just a cultural motif that has travelled along with the Abrahamic faiths that came out of the Middle East? Really, really interesting stuff. In that the origin seems to have similar veins, the particular talismans against the fairies have similar veins, and the powers have similar veins. The power of invisibility, the power of shape-shifting, the access to treasure and secrets and hidden knowledge, all very similar between the Djinn and the fairies. So, while it is massively simplistic to say they're the same things, they are, I think, descriptions of the similar territory. But the one thing I think that is specifically different, and we have to take acknowledgement of this, is that if we're talking about nature spirits or spirits associated with a certain locality, they are not the same. They are different. The rest of it, the lore around them, potentially has the same source. So, I hope that was interesting. I hope it was food for thought, and I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments section below. And also, I wanted to invite people, if they have experiences that they want to share or write about, please feel free to stick them in the comments below or drop me a message on my website at www.daramasonfield.com. Anyway, if you enjoyed this, please give me a like and remember to subscribe. Take care and talk soon.